So once again this year, M&Ms are making it to the forefront of who we are at Grace, the mission and ministry of God's people, working together to break free of ingrained habits of our world in order to live into the world that God desires as God's people. As we started off our Breaking Free theme for the last month or so, Pastor Dahlseng gave us 3 points as he was exemplifying the story of Moses. And if you remember them, I want you to help me finish them. We'll go over them twice. First of all, it all begins with whom? God. And then second, God works through people. And third, it's all about what? Relationships. All right, let's say that all together one more time. First, it all begins with God. And second, God works through people. And it is all about very good. So even in the midst of this week's chapter on war, death, and destruction, these 3 ideas, these 3 ways that God works are still in place. I've been thinking about this chapter on Joshua for a couple of months now, and no matter how you look at it, it's a hard chapter. It's a hard part of the history of the Israelites, and it's hard to find the gospel in. It's a hard chapter because as Americans we continue to see the effects of the manifest destiny thinking, which has led to poverty, which has led to war and oppression. This behavior that has led to unnecessary violence and rampant racism, not just here in America, but throughout the world. When I say racism, specifically about in America, I'm talking about more than just our historical whites and African Americans. Racism is against Indians, especially around the reservations. Racism is against people who have heritages from other nationalities, Latinos being among them. It is not to say that God is not involved in these early stories of people occupying the land. It's just that as I read the Gospels, I see this occupying the land different than ownership of a physical piece of land. I see it as more about being a part of the land and the people who are already there, allowing God's kingdom to emerge out of that. You see, for Christ, it is an attitude of God occupying the land through relationships. It begins with God in this conversation. In John's gospel, it is a conversation that Jesus has with the woman at the well, and God working through that Samaritan woman to bring the village back to Christ. It is about God working through the Samaritan man in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is about God and pointing to Christ and relationships when we're told to go that extra mile. And for the Israelites, that was even in the midst of a Roman soldier forcing you to go the first one. You see, this occupation that is being talked about in this chapter of the story is not about death and destruction and then owning the land. The occupation is about God occupying the hearts of people so they may follow the one true God in our world, because it all begins with and God works through, and it is all about. And if it's all about relationship, how can those relationships be formed in the midst of people being destroyed, oppressed, or made to feel they do not belong? As a Christian, this chapter on Joshua is troublesome, and it forces us to take a look at and see some of the themes being speaking to us today. You see, our first lesson is full of some imagery of communities of God, the people of Israel, walking the walls of Jericho. They do this once a day for 6 straight days, walking around the walls that they're hoping to conquer, that they're hoping to overcome. And then on that seventh day, they walked the walls of Jericho 7 times, blowing trumpets the whole time. But then in that last final walk around, they blow the trumpets, the people rise up, they shout, and the walls fall, and Jericho is overtaken. While this could be a sermon on breaking the walls separating us from God on an individual basis, and that would make a great sermon, I believe this text is about the walls that we can overcome when we work together as a community. This text is about the issues we face as a community and working towards tearing down walls that prevent us from being the people of God and allowing God to occupy this land. Overcoming walls that have been erected keeping people oppressed. Walls erected causing racism in our world. Walls that have pushed people to the outside. Walls that sometimes don't necessarily hold people out, but they can enclose people in. Walls keeping people in a perpetual cycle of shame, hurt, and poverty. It takes more than one person's own strength to break these walls, these chains holding us captive. It takes a community to bring an end to these walls. It takes a community because God works through people who belong to communities to break these chains. You see, the walls of Jericho serve as a reminder of how working together we can accomplish huge strides in the mission and ministry of grace, especially working together as a community to break chains and tear down the walls in order for God's grace, justice, and care to be shown. God's care is shown at Grace quite often. One of the highlights of our week here is on Fridays, through not because we get to leave for the weekend, but is because we have Friday Fun Fest. And we get to make an impact in the kids who come over from Loves Park Elementary School each week. You see, each week 30 to 40 volunteers come out doing justice work, building relationships, and sharing a hobby. Now, I know I use this example a lot, but I think this is a good example in this case here, because it is about a group, a community of people coming together to tear down some of the walls and build people up. And I was thinking about it this past week, especially in relationships to this, because I remember those early weeks leading up to our first Friday Fun Fest, as I was trying to gather some volunteers to pull this whole deal off. And so gathering the volunteers, I could just see in the look of fear in people's eyes when I said, hey, we're going to invite 40 youth or children from Loves Park Elementary School to come over. How would you like to help out? And the eyes would just get huge. And the reason the eyes were huge is, first off, people were saying to themselves, there's no way I can deal with 40 kids all at one time. It's not my gifts. I can't do that alone. And then I'd have to calm them down and say, whoa, take a step back. We're not doing this alone. We're going to take this on together. And we're going to work together. Little did I know that at that first Friday Fun Fest, it wasn't going to be 40 kids, it was 80, and we've now grown that to 150 kids that come over each week. But what was interesting, what's neat to note, is that it wasn't one person, even though some people felt like the weight of the world was being placed on them. It was about us coming together as a community to accomplish it. For some, it was sharing hobbies and skills that were already known. For others, it was working with the 75 to 80 kids all at one time, leading a game. And what's been fun is watching as we've had some new people come in and start to learn new leadership skills and become the leaders of those large group games, while others still like the comfort of their smaller groups. See, this M&M is allowing God to work through the volunteers to show these kids from our neighborhood that God loves them. And it's not just one person, it is a community of people gathering together to take this on. I pick on Friday Fun Fest because so many of you are involved with it or have been involved with it at one point in time. But the same could be said about many of our M&Ms. Like our quilters, a community gathered that works and has its process to create quilts. People each using their own gifts. Some cut the squares, others sew the squares together, others lay out squares to say this is what the final product is, and still others stitch together the pieces of fabric. Or our choir coming together, each with their own voices to create our choir, to create music for us to listen to and worship God. I also think about a couple of months ago when several guys gathered together because we had rented a lift here for the sanctuary to get up into some of the higher crevices of the church to change the light bulbs. There's a joke in that somewhere, I know. But there's a group of guys that would work together to get them up, to get this man lift up onto the chancel area, get it ready, and then we all watched as one crazy fellow got up there and took it all the way up. The whole time the lift is swaying a little bit back and forth and changing the light bulbs, and then working on the fans to service them, and then going down into the gym. You see, it was a group of guys working together to get this done. It was a community. My point is this: these M&Ms are the result of the community gathered together with their talents to overcome what could seem like the walls of Jericho. Doing it together, gathered by God and not alone. Grace through the years has worked to break these chains throughout its history, through many of its missions and ministry. One example is started 70 years ago with our preschool, a ministry founded on the need to educate the youngest children before heading off to school. Started as a kindergarten and then working into a preschool when it was seen that this is a need for our country. It was forward-looking and embraced by the community and gave the children a head start. And these children were allowed to grow in intelligence by creating relationships. With young kids at Friday Fun Fest, these kids will have more adult relationships in their lives growing up and grow to be more successful in life. By providing blankets around the world, people will be warm tonight. By maintaining this building, we'll have a place to be sent from and place to worship God. By teaching job skills, our youth will find proper employment, and guess what? We get cookies and cupcakes out of it. As we look around, though, we see places where the walls still exist in our world, walls of oppression standing tall. As we see these walls as God's community, we are called to tear them down and let God's grace and light in. As Christians, we are to find ways to take on oppression, especially when oppression is easiest, by praying upon those who find themselves in situations it is easy to fall victim, especially when we have all the resources necessary to overcome it. Don't get me wrong, though. I'm not talking about enabling poor behavior. Enabling poor behavior only creates taller walls for people to overcome. I'm talking about coming together as a community to educate and stand against those who prey upon the ones who feel they have nowhere else to turn. Specifically this morning, I'm talking about the payday loan industry, which preys upon people who can least afford it. You see, when I drive from my home just on the other side in Rockford, and up 251 to my family video store, I pass by about 8 of these places that while they claim to offer a service and provide people with the cash they need in emergency, it actually creates oppression and creates walls. While what they do is legal, the exorbitant interest rates could be considered extortion, keeping people locked in a cycle of borrowing, a cycle of oppression and poverty. What is more is that these places, while they offer loans, are taking money out of people's pockets and taking valuable resources out of this community. These are walls that as a community of faith we can break down by educating people on how to properly handle their finances, and then work with ethical financial institutions to create loans that help to build up when emergencies do happen. What would happen? What would it look like if God's people decided to take on these types of issues? What would happen? The shops which charge 30% or more per week could be turned into a place that many of us might actually like to shop, creating real jobs and having a real impact in our neighborhoods, in our community. What would happen? You see, as the people of God, we have the power as a community for this to happen. Working together to educate people on financial matters, working together to gather people around the table to make short-term loans available at no interest for short periods of time, or at least at a fair interest rate. And don't get me wrong, this isn't my original idea. I've stolen it from somewhere else. But another church is able to make that happen in other parts of our world. Why can't we, as God's people, gathered here? Likewise, what would happen if our community decided to take on the obesity epidemic? Gathering together people to teach them how to cook nutritious food, nutritious meals. What would happen to this obesity epidemic that is sweeping the nation? We could have an impact that would make a bigger impact than just the waistlines. It would have an impact on the well-being, the mental well-being of so many. Relationships would be formed in God's name, and we would have a healthier community. But don't get me wrong, these aren't quick fixes to tearing down these walls. These fixes take time. It took time for the walls of Jericho to fall. Each day the Israelites walked around those walls. Each day for 6 days, and then on the 7th day they went at it a lot harder. They walked around it 7 times. They blew trumpets and they yelled charge, and the walls came down. They didn't do it alone. They did it in community. These chains we do not face alone. We face them as a community because it begins with God, and God works through people. Last year our slogan was to find your M&M. This year, what might some of those M&Ms be that you found? What might be some of those missions and ministry that you are already participating in? Or maybe God is calling you to gather others around you to tear down walls that you're seeing, so that God's grace, love, and mercy might be shown to the world. Now, if you're interested in what I've talked about this morning, or seeing other areas God might be calling us to as a church, share them with Pastor Dahlseng or myself, or Rebecca Stewart, our council representative who heads up our Community Development Committee. Because it's important to remember in all of this, as with the Israelite community, we do not face these walls alone. We do it allowing God to work through us as a community. Amen. I invite you to stand together as we sing our hymn of the day.